You need directions somewhere, sir? Walt didn't answer right away. He set the clipboard back on the duty desk with 2 fingers, neat, the way you'd set down something that belonged to someone else. Signed his name in the log, date, time, bay assignment. Then he picked up his coffee thermos and walked past the airman toward the interior doors without once looking up. The airman watched him go, opened his mouth, closed it. The man was maybe 70, maybe older. Faded olive canvas shirt, sleeves rolled, 2 buttons gone at the chest, work boots that had been resoled at least once. He moved through the fluorescent wash of the duty room like he was navigating by memory, not sight. A straight line toward Bay 3. No hesitation, not a single glance at the signage. The airman looked down at the log. Kowalski, W. 0527, he almost called out again. Didn't. Windows down again, his neighbor had said once, pulling into the driveway at 6 in the morning and catching Walt backing out. In November, Walt hadn't answered that either. He drove the same route every morning. Left the house at 4:14, give or take 2 minutes. Down Route 231, past the grain elevator that hadn't operated in 8 years, left at the county road where the stop sign still had a bullet hole in it from some drunk's idea of a good time circa 2003. 11.4 miles. He knew it in the dark the way he knew everything he'd ever done enough times, not with his eyes, but with something older. The fence line sat at the eastern perimeter of the airfield. There was a gravel pull-off there, unofficial, worn into the shoulder by years of plane spotters and aviation students from the community college. Walt parked with the truck nose pointed toward the tarmac and shut the engine down and sat. The thermos was olive drab, was government surplus, actual surplus, the kind with the rubber gasket that you had to press down hard to seat right or it leaked. He'd had it for 19 years. The coffee inside was black. He poured a cup into the steel cap and set it on the dash and left it there while it cooled. The window was down. That was the thing his neighbor didn't understand. Hadn't tried to explain it. The air that moved across an airfield in the early dark had a particular quality, a flatness, a cleanness, a faint smell of jet exhaust and hydraulic fluid and damp concrete that was not unpleasant if you'd spent 34 years soaking it into your skin. You couldn't get that through glass. He sat with his elbow on the door and listened to the wind come across the tarmac and felt it move against his forearm and didn't think about much. On the passenger seat was the logbook. Not a maintenance log, not official anything. A spiral-bound notebook, the kind with the black and white marbled cover worn so soft at the corners it had gone velvet. He'd filled 3 of them over the years. This was the 3rd. Inside were handwritten start sequences, procedures, fault trees, recovery checklists for aircraft that were mostly gone now. T-55 turboshaft cold ambient starts, the Chinook variants, TF-33 restarts at altitude, a H-64 a cold weather TECU sequencing from the original Boeing developmental test protocols, written out in his own hand because he'd written the originals, and writing them again was how he remembered what he knew. Some of the procedures had been superseded. Some of the aircraft were in museums. One of them, the developmental Apache he'd put 300 hours on at Boeing Field, had been cut up for parts. He'd heard that from a man he trusted and hadn't looked it up after. Some things you didn't need to confirm. He drank the coffee when it had cooled enough not to burn. Watched the flight line. There wasn't much to see at this hour. A fuel truck making its rounds, a distant sodium light buzzing over the maintenance apron, the shape of the Apache under its work lights faint through the chain link. He'd been watching them try to stand that aircraft up for a static display for 2 weeks now. Saw the trucks come in, saw the contractors, saw the frustration from 400 yards away in the way men moved when something wasn't going right. The specific posture of engineers who had tried 3 things and were reaching for a 4th with less confidence than the first. He finished the coffee, poured a 2nd cup, didn't drink it. The wind moved across the tarmac. Somewhere past the hangars, a door opened and closed. Just the wind doing what wind does on a flat piece of concrete in the early dark in Tennessee. He sat there for 20 minutes, like always. Then he capped the thermos, rolled up the window, and started the truck. The maintenance bay was cold at that hour. Cold the way hangars always are. Concrete and steel holding the night longer than the air outside does, the temperature sitting 10 degrees below the tarmac, maybe 15. Walt didn't mind it. He'd stopped minding cold a long time ago. He badged through the side door at 0527. The duty airman, a young specialist with his collar still uneven, looked up from the desk and did a slow blink. "Sir, do you have a work order?" Walt set his thermos on the edge of the counter and signed the log. Block letters. Neat. He had the kind of handwriting that came from filling out forms in cockpits during turbulence for 3 decades, small and controlled and completely legible. He capped the pen, slid the log back, picked up the thermos. "Bay 3, he said. That was all. He walked past the desk before the specialist could figure out what to do about him. The Apache was sitting under portable work lights in the back of the bay, and Walt stopped just inside the cone of light and looked at it the way a man looks at something he used to know very well and hasn't seen in a while. Not with surprise, with the specific quiet of recognition. Then he walked toward it. His right hand found the forward avionics bay panel before his eyes did. Fingers on the fastener heads, testing the torque with a pressure that wasn't quite a push and wasn't quite a pull, just a read. This one was fine. He moved left. Next panel. His hand was already there before he'd consciously decided to check it, sliding to the seam at the lower edge, feeling the gap. A little proud on the aft corner. Not enough to matter. He noted it the way you note a familiar thing. He moved around the nose, trailing one hand along the fuselage. The skin of an Apache is not smooth. It's a layered thing, composite over frame, access panels and sensor housings and antenna fairings interrupting the surface every few feet. Walt moved through all of it without hesitating. His fingers found the FLIR housing, traced the edge of the IHADSS sensor cluster, dropped down to the gun mount, and rested there for a moment. Not checking anything. Just resting. It was quiet enough that he could hear the overhead fluorescent bank at the front of the bay, cycling. That low 60-cycle hum with a flicker in it about every 9 seconds. He'd been in 100 bays with that exact same flicker, maybe 1,000. He worked his way aft. Tail boom. Stabilator. He pressed 2 fingers flat against the gearbox fairing and held them there. Nothing vibrated because nothing was running, but he held them there anyway. He had done this, at various points in his life, to engines that were very much running, standing in the noise and the heat with his hand against a casing, reading what the instruments couldn't show him. The memory lived in his hands more than his head. Around the main rotor mast, he looked up at the blade roots, looked at the droop stops, didn't touch those. You don't touch those without a reason, but he looked, and whatever he was looking for, he found or didn't find, and he moved on. He came back around to the port side, to the crew station ladder, and stopped. Looked at the cockpit. The canopy was open, both stations. He didn't climb up. He just stood there for a moment, hands at his sides, looking at the seat and the panel and the cyclic grip with its switches, worn smooth at the edges from 10,000 hours of thumbs. Somebody else's 10,000 hours, not his, not anymore. He stepped back, picked up his thermos, found a stool near the tool locker and sat down in the shadow at the edge of the work lights, and waited. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back behind the yellow line." Pullen said it the way people say things when they expect compliance, not unkind exactly, but not interested in discussion either. He was maybe 30. Clean uniform, fresh creases, clipboard already open to a checklist that looked like it had been laminated and relaminated until the corners had gone soft. He'd walked in at the head of a file of 6 engineers and hadn't broken stride when he spotted Walt on the stool. Walt looked at him. That stillness settled in. No shift, no nod, no adjustment of posture. Just eyes on Pullen's face, reading it the way you'd read an instrument panel. Pullen waited a half second, then gestured toward the painted line on the concrete apron. Yellow, flaking at the edges, running the full width of the bay entrance. "The line, sir. Ceremony prep is restricted to credentialed personnel." Walt stood, picked up his thermos, moved back 2 steps, not to the line, but back, just enough. Pullen watched him for a moment, then turned back to his clipboard. The 6 engineers fanned out around the Apache. They were competent looking, most of them, and they moved with the efficiency of people who'd done this before. Diagnostic tablets appeared. Access panels came open in sequence. The port avionics bay, the hydraulic checkpoints, the TECU access on the starboard side of the aft fuselage. Someone hauled a ground power unit into position. Someone else pulled up the maintenance record on a laptop balanced on the nose. Walt sat back down on the stool. He watched them with the stillness that Pullen had already mistaken for vacancy. His eyes moved in small, controlled arcs, panel to cable run to panel, his fingers loose around the thermos, not gripping. He'd seen this exact pattern of movement before, seen it fail before. The APU came up, a good clean sound, all the right harmonics for the temperature. Then they started the sequence. The turbine turned over, climbed through the low registers, and stopped. Not a failure exactly, not a bang or a cutoff, just a refusal. The kind of refusal that doesn't trip alarms because it isn't dramatic enough to be an alarm. The kind that sits in a fault loop and waits for someone to ask it the right question. One of the engineers frowned at his tablet, said something to the man beside him. They tried again. Same result. Pullen came up behind them, looked at the tablet, made a note on his clipboard, checked his watch. It was 05:52. The general's arrival was fixed at 0900, and ceremony prep required a running aircraft by 0730 at the latest. That was 2 hours and 38 minutes, and the note he made on his clipboard was the kind of note people make when they're calculating whether they still have time. They did not look at Walt. Walt looked at the TECU access panel on the starboard aft quarter. It was closed now, the engineer having moved on. But he'd seen how the man had worked the sequence. He'd seen exactly which step had come in which order. He unscrewed the thermos cap, poured a small cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm, drank it, set the cup down on his knee. The engineers tried a third time, a fourth. Each attempt was professional and methodical, and missing the same thing by the same margin. Pullen glanced over at Walt once. Just once. An assessing look, the kind you give to something that might be in the way but isn't worth addressing yet. Walt didn't move. He set the thermos cup down on the stool beside him and folded his hands and watched the access panel he wasn't allowed near. The fluorescent overhead flickered once and held. The first start attempt came at 0537. Walt watched Pullen's lead engineer, young guy, maybe 26, shirt still creased from the bag, climb into the left seat cockpit and run through the pre-start checklist with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this on a simulator many more times than on an actual aircraft. The APU spun up fine. That part always worked. Then the T-700 ignition sequence began, and Walt heard the turbine try to catch and then not catch, and then the engineer called something down to the crew chief and they ran it again. Same result. The second attempt was 6 minutes later. They'd adjusted something on the TECU panel. Walt could tell from the way the crew chief moved, purposeful, like he'd been given a specific instruction. The turbine tried harder this time. There was a half second where it almost sounded like it was going to light. Then it didn't. Pullen's jaw was moving, not talking, just working. Walt picked up his thermos cup, found it empty, set it back down. The third attempt failed faster than the second. That was the tell. When a fault loop is latent and you keep trying to start through it with the same sequence, you don't inch closer to a solution, you compound the error. The TECU was learning the wrong thing with each cycle. Walt had written that exact sentence in a Boeing technical report in the fall of 1997, and he had never expected to watch someone prove it in real time 27 years later. But there it was. Pullen turned from the aircraft. He scanned the bay. His eyes found Walt standing exactly where he'd left him, behind the yellow line, hands folded, still as a fence post. "Sir." The word came out flatter this time, not polite, just barely professional. "I really need you somewhere else. We're running out of time, and having an observer in the work area is—" "I'm behind the line," Walt said. Pullen looked at the line on the floor, looked at Walt. His clipboard went to his hip like a shield. "You have a visitor badge," Pullen said, "which means someone signed you in as a guest, and guests don't stand inside active maintenance bays during critical troubleshooting windows." He said it like he was reading from something, like the words had an official weight he was borrowing. "I don't know what your connection to this facility is, but I need you to wait outside." Walt looked at him for a moment, nodded his eyes, at his clipboard, the way he was holding it. "I'll stay behind the line," Walt said. That was all. Pullen made a sound that wasn't quite a word and turned back to his engineers. He said something too quiet to hear. One of the engineers looked back at Walt once and then didn't again. It was around that time that Staff Sergeant Okonkwo stopped watching the aircraft. She'd been crew chief on this particular bird for 11 months. She knew its sounds the way you know a bad floorboard in your own house, by feel, by expectation, by absence. 3 failed starts told her something she didn't have a name for yet. But what pulled her attention away from the cowling was not the engine. It was the old man behind the yellow line. He hadn't moved in 40 minutes. Not his feet, not his shoulders, but his eyes. His eyes moved, methodically, panel to panel, access door to access door, like he was reading something written on the aircraft in a language she didn't speak. He wasn't watching the engineers work. He was watching the helicopter. The two things were not the same. She took 3 steps sideways, slow, casual. She positioned herself where she could watch his face instead of the cockpit. The turbine ticked as it cooled. Walt's eyes settled on Bay 3 and stopped moving. Pullen had the radio up before Walt's second step crossed the line. Bray. Base Ops, this is Pullen. Bay 2, I need a security call. I've got an unauthorized... Walt wasn't listening. Or he was, but it didn't register the way Pullen meant it to. His eyes were already on the access panel. His boots moved across the stained concrete with no hesitation, no apology built into the stride. Just direction. Okonkwo didn't move to stop him. She watched Pullen's face instead. Bay 3 was the far left alcove, a recessed service station set back from the main floor, bolted panel on the lower starboard side of the airframe, about knee height when you were standing, about eye level when you crouched down. Walt crouched down. His knees took the descent without complaint. His right hand found the panel latch before his eyes did. Fingers reading the cold steel edge, locating the release tab by shape, by position, by something older than sight. The panel swung open. "Sir!" Pullen's voice came up behind him, clipped and controlled, still professional, but thinner now. "Sir, I need you to step back behind..." "Hold on." Just that. 2 words. Walt's voice was flat and unhurried, the way you'd say, hold on to someone handing you a part you weren't ready for yet. Pullen stopped mid-stride. Inside the panel, a laminated card was bolted to the interior bracket. Yellow border, header text in bold. Below it, a procedure, numbered steps, precise language, margins clean. It had been there for years. Most of the crew chiefs had probably stopped reading it the way you stop reading a fire extinguisher label. It was just part of the wall. Walt didn't look at the card. He looked past it to the wiring harness beside the turbine engine control unit, the TECU, the black module, roughly the size of a hardback book, seated in its bracket. He tilted his head slightly, not performance, just the angle he needed. One of the engineers had come around the nose of the aircraft. He was watching now. A young specialist, early 20s, still holding a diagnostic tablet. He hadn't said anything in the last 40 minutes. He was the only one who hadn't. Walt looked up at him. "Crew chief?" The specialist blinked. "No, sir. Jenkins. No, Crew Chief Sergeant Alderman. He stepped out to..." "You'll do." Walt pointed to the TECU bracket. "Pull the breaker. Bay 3, lower panel, 3rd position from the left. Hold it 8 seconds, then resequence from idle to tent." Jenkins looked at the tablet, then at the TECU, then at Pullen. Pullen still had the radio in his hand. He hadn't finished his transmission. His thumb was on the push to talk, and he hadn't finished it. "That's not in the fault tree," Pullen said. His voice had changed, not angry anymore. Something more uncertain. "We ran every procedure in the... It's a latent fault loop." Walt's tone didn't shift. "Out-of-sequence rotor brake release on a cold ambient start. TECU holds the error and locks the ignition cycle. Army Field Manual doesn't have it by name, but it's in there by implication." He paused. "Pull the breaker, hold 8 seconds, idle to tent." Nobody moved for about 2 full seconds. Then Jenkins crouched beside Walt, found the breaker panel, and pulled the 3rd position. Walt counted to himself. Not out loud. His lips didn't move. He was just quiet in the way he'd been quiet all morning, completely still, completely present, the way you get when you've learned that some things cannot be rushed, and fighting that fact only costs you time you don't have. 8 seconds. Jenkins looked at him. Walt nodded once. Jenkins resequenced. The turbine caught. Not all at once. It found itself a low groan that climbed through registers, unsteady at first, then steadying, then rising into that unmistakable whine that every Apache crew chief in the world knows the way a parent knows a child's breathing in the dark. Healthy. Climbing. Right. Jenkins stood up from the panel with both hands still on the breaker rail. He looked at Pullen. Pullen had stopped talking into the radio. Nobody moved. The turbine climbed through idle, past idle, found its sweet spot, and held. The portable work lights threw the rotorhead's shadow long across the concrete apron. The shadow turned slowly as the systems pressurized. Staff Sergeant Okonkwo was the only person in the bay who wasn't watching the aircraft. She was looking at Bay 3's open access panel, the one Walt had crouched beside 7 minutes ago. The one with the laminated card bolted inside it, yellow with age, the lamination cracked at one corner, the text in small, clean Arial that had been printed sometime in the last century and had outlasted 3 Apache variants. She pulled out her flashlight and put the beam on it. She read it once to herself, then she read it again. Sergeant Pullen, her voice was flat, even, exactly the register she used when she needed someone to hear her over an engine. Pullen lowered the radio. What? This card. She didn't elaborate. She stepped aside and let the flashlight speak for her. Pullen crossed the bay in 4 steps. He read it. The clipboard came up out of reflex and out of habit, the way he always held it when he was processing something, like the clipboard was a wall to stand behind. He read the bottom line, the authorship line. He read it twice. Behind him, the turbine held its note. Okonkwo turned toward Walt. He was standing where he had been standing since Jenkins resequenced, both hands loose at his sides, watching the instrument feeds on the access panel the way a man watches weather he predicted 3 days ago. She read it aloud. Not loudly, just clearly, the way you say something when you want it to land without theater. Procedure developed by CW-5W Kowalski, Boeing Field Test Division, Seattle, 1997. The bay went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with noise. The turbine was still winding, the fluorescent bank still flickered, but the room had a different quality now, like a frequency had shifted just below the threshold of hearing. Pullen turned around. Walt wasn't looking at him. He was watching the tachometer needle settle. One of the engineers, the youngest one, said quietly, "That's him?" Nobody answered. The turbine answered for them, climbing to governed idle with the smooth authority of something that had been waiting to run correctly. Okonkwo looked at Walt. She was trying to find something in his face, surprise at being found out, satisfaction, something. There was nothing. He was tracking the instruments the way he had been tracking everything in this bay since 0527, with the same absolute stillness, the same total attention that had looked like vacancy to everyone who wasn't watching closely enough. Pullen set his clipboard down, not on the workbench, not on a cart. He set it on the floor, like he'd forgotten it was in his hand, like the weight of it had changed. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that the card hadn't already said, that the engine hadn't already said, in a language older than any of the credentials he had driven down here with this morning. Walt finally looked up from the instrument feeds. The turbine was healthy. It was holding. That was the only thing that needed to be true. The turbine was healthy. It was holding. That was the only thing that needed to be true. Then the second flag came up. One of Pullen's engineers saw it first, a young specialist named Drayden, standing at the instrument panel on the port side, and he said it quietly, almost to himself, the way you say something when you hope you're wrong. "We've got a FADEC advisory, Channel B." Nobody moved. Pullen turned from where he was standing, clipboard still raised, and the radio call he'd been mid-sentence on just stopped. He looked at the panel. He looked at Drayden. He looked at the 6 engineers who were all suddenly very interested in their shoes. The Channel B advisory on a FADEC dual-channel system meant one thing to most people in that room: abort the run, full diagnostic sweep, possibly scrub the ceremony. Most people. Walt was already looking at the panel, not walking toward it, not reacting, just looking. His head had turned before Drayden finished the sentence, and now he was still, that absolute, total stillness. His eyes moved across the display in a pattern that wasn't random. Left quadrant, center stack, right of the fuel governor indicator, 2 seconds, maybe 3. He said, Channel BTECU integration lag, Boeing designation Echo 77 Whiskey. He paused. Tell her to nudge the throttle friction lock forward a half click and hold for 6 seconds. Don't touch anything else. Okonkwo was already moving. Not because she'd been told to, because she'd been watching this man for the last 20 minutes, and she had learned something fundamental about the weight of a sentence delivered without decoration. She reached the throttle quadrant, she found the friction lock, she moved it forward, not a full click, half, and held it. 1 second, 2, 3. Drayden was watching the display, and you could see his posture change before he said anything. His shoulders came down half an inch, his head came forward. He said, "Advisory's clearing." 4 seconds, 5, 6. It's gone. He looked up. The flag's gone. The turbine didn't notice. It held its rev. The fuel flow stayed exactly where it was supposed to be. The aircraft didn't know it had just stumped every technical resource the National Guard could field in 6 hours, and been corrected in under 40 seconds by 2 sentences from a man in a canvas workshirt with 2 buttons missing. Pullen's clipboard came down to his side. He wasn't looking at his engineers. He wasn't looking at Drayden or the instrument panel or the advisory he'd never found in his field manual, because the Boeing designation for Echo 77 Whiskey hadn't made it into the Army's current service documentation. It was in Boeing's field test archive from 1997, somewhere in a binder in Seattle that nobody had opened in 15 years. He was looking at Walt. Walt wasn't looking back. He was looking at the engine cowling. One hand was at his side, the other had moved, without any instruction from the conscious part of his brain, to rest flat against the fuselage just forward of the exhaust, feeling the vibration. The way a doctor puts 2 fingers to a wrist, checking, not performing, listening through his palm. The turbine was even, smooth. It had found its rhythm and settled there the way a healthy engine does when everything is right. Walt's hand came away. He straightened up, slow. Behind him, someone had been trying to find Echo 77 Whiskey in the current Army field manual for the last 90 seconds. They were not going to find it. It was not there. It had existed in one form, in one document, written by one person, tested across 17 developmental airframes at Boeing Field in a wet Seattle winter in 1997. The engine ran. That was the only explanation the Apache was going to offer. Okonkwo waited until the turbine settled into its steady idle before she crossed the bay toward him. Walt was already at the bench. Not packing up, he didn't have anything to pack, just standing with his hands resting on the edge of it, looking at the logbook he'd set there when he came in, the worn one, the one with the handwritten sequences. She stopped 2 feet from him and didn't rush it. "Why didn't you put your name somewhere people would see it?" she said. It wasn't quite a question, more like something she needed to say out loud to make it real. Walt didn't answer right away. That stillness came over him again, the total kind, the kind that had unsettled the duty airmen at 0527 and made Pullen's engineers shift on their feet without knowing why. He looked at the logbook, not at her. Then he said, "Engine doesn't care who fixed it." He picked up the logbook. "It just needs to run." Okonkwo stood there. The turbine was steady behind her, that deep, low pulse that filled the corrugated steel bay and pressed against your sternum if you stood close enough. She didn't say anything for a moment because there was nothing to add to that. The man had spent 3 decades writing procedures that other people used, bolting his name inside access panels nobody opened unless something had already gone wrong, and the procedure had either worked or it hadn't. That was the entire transaction. That was the whole of it. She looked at the logbook under his arm. Really looked at it this time. The cover was cracked along the spine, the corners soft with handling, the pages swelled out at the edges where years of entries had thickened them. She'd thought it was a personal log, some kind of diary. She understood now that it wasn't. Those handwritten sequences, start procedures, fault codes, recovery steps cataloged in a careful compressed hand, they were for aircraft that had already been decommissioned, systems that no longer existed in any active fleet. He had written them down anyway. He had kept them. Not because anyone would need them, because he had needed to keep them. She thought about what the airman had told her when she'd come in, that the old man in the workshirt had come through the gate at 0527, signed the log without being asked, and walked to the aircraft like he already knew the way, which he did, which he had always known. 34 years of knowing. And then a morning came, the same as the other mornings, except an Apache was cold and silent, and the ceremony was 2 hours out, and 7 engineers had not found the fault. So he'd come through the gate like he always did, signed the log, watched until he saw what they couldn't see. That was all. That was the whole of it. "You've been coming to the fence line," Okonkwo said quietly, not accusing, just placing a fact. Walt looked at her then, just briefly. Yeah. Every morning. He didn't confirm it. He didn't need to. She could read it in the logbook under his arm, in the handwritten entries for systems nobody flew anymore, in the way his hands had gone to the fuselage panels at 0530 before anyone else was in the bay, checking fasteners by feel, running the sequence the way you do when something is yours even after it isn't. He came because the aircraft were still here, because something in him that 34 years had built did not know how to stop answering. The turbine ran behind them, even, low, certain. It did not know his name. It did not know that the man who had written the procedure that started it was standing 10 feet away with a cracked logbook under his arm and 2 buttons missing from his shirt. It just ran. That was the only answer it had ever had for him, and he had spent a long time learning to find it enough. He signed out at 0612, same pen, same neat block letters. The duty airman didn't ask him anything this time. Walt walked back across the apron in the gray morning light, past the yellow line, past the work lights still burning white against the concrete, past Pullen's clipboard sitting on the ground where he'd set it down. Nobody had picked it up yet. His truck was where he'd left it, engine cold. He got in, settled against the seat, and poured the last of the thermos into the cup. It had gone lukewarm. He drank it anyway. Behind him, through the passenger window, he could hear the base beginning to move. Voices, a vehicle radio, the distant bark of someone calling formation. The convoy would be through the gate in minutes. Walt set the cup on the dash and rolled the window down. The wind came across the tarmac the same way it always had, low and flat and carrying the faint smell of JP8 and wet grass. Somewhere behind the corrugated steel wall, a turbine was turning, steady and clean and untroubled. He closed his eyes. That was enough. That had always been enough.